call the city council meeting orders 4:32. Roll call, please.
Slusher?
Yes.
Fetch?
Yes.
Feltes?
Yep.
Wojni?
Yep.
Mason? Holstead?
Yes.
We have a quorum. Pledge of allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Verification of posting.
The agenda was posted at City Hall, State Bank of Arcadia, Arcadia TV and appliance on the city website on Thursday,
Thank you.
May
We
3rd.
have a 15-item agenda.
So moved.
Motion by Feltes, second.
So
By Fetch. Clerk will call the roll.
Fetch?
Yes.
Feltes?
Yeah.
Wojni?
Yes.
Holstead?
Yes.
Slusher?
Yes.
Public comment. Public comment?
I'd like to say some things, Mayor, if I could.
Sure.
I guess I just want to say that I guess I always knew it, but I'm impressed at the way we operate as a city hall, as a community in general. You know, we had some tough times here the past couple weeks, and I appreciate the understanding of everybody here, everybody in the city. You know, we don't just work together. I guess we are kind of like family. That being said, I know there was some rumblings at times, and I thought about it. Being my family situation has changed, if I would have to resign my position. At this time, I have decided to not resign, and as long, God willing, fulfill my obligation to the city council for 2 years. So, at this time.
We appreciate that, Adam. We
Yeah.
appreciate your service, and
Thank you.
you all know how we feel. We're
And
understanding, and if you can't make it, we are behind you wholeheartedly.
No, and I think we had a good talk about this before, Mr. Mayor, and I think we both know how we all feel about it, so.
Family first.
It is family first, but I think with the way it's been brought up to me and posted and brought to me, I think I can do it. I have a good support staff and family, so expect me to see my ugly face here for another 2 years. That's all I have.
Thank you, Adam.
Well.
Any other public comment?
Top that, Doc.
That's pretty good.
Hearing none, we'll move on. Presentations, we have none this evening. Old business, approval of meeting minutes from April 16th.
So moved.
Motion by Fetch, is there a second?
I'll second.
By Holstead. Any changes?
Yeah. There, let's see, economic development, am I not supposed to be in that?
That should have been changed, I believe. Angela? Todd Fetch on the meeting minutes, it should, because we changed it that night when we voted on it.
Correct.
so, Yep,
I know we talked about it, but I didn't see.
You
it.
added him to economic development?
yep,
Or subtracted.
yeah.
She's a big over there.
If there's no other changes? Hearing none, the clerk will call the roll.
Feltes?
Abstain.
Wojni?
Yes.
Holstead?
Yes.
Slusher?
One abstain.
Yes, but did you say my name yet?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry.
Since you were here.
Fetch?
I'm just trying to.
Fetch.
Yes, ma'am.
Motion carries.
Yes.
So Slusher and Feltes abstain?
Yes.
Correct.
Did it pass it? No, we had three to two.
Approval of meeting minutes from April 18th, 2008.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Feltes, second by Fetch. Any changes in that? Hearing none, clerk will call the roll.
Feltes?
Yep.
Wojni?
Yep.
Holstead?
Yes.
Slusher?
Abstain.
Fetch?
Yes.
Feltes?
Yeah.
Motion carries. Meeting minutes from April 26th, 2018.
So moved.
Motion by Feltes, is there a second?
Yes.
By Fetch.
I can't, I wasn't here.
You just abstained.
Any changes?
Yes, on the paragraph that starts with Jim Maloney, I don't know if there's extra words or we're missing some commas or whatever, but the sentence, the councilman Feltes stated, I don't know if we need the in there. Would it be more understandable if there was a comma after this and a comma after side? So it would read, Councilman Feltus stated that this comma, the downstream side comma, would have to be dredged also. Anyways, it was difficult to understand if you didn't know what it was.
Make those changes. Anything else?
Jim Cochi sentence there? Oh, Jim Maloney.
Jim Maloney. Hearing none, clerk will call the roll.
Wojni,
Yes.
Olsted.
Yes?
Slusher.
Abstain.
Fetch.
Yes.
Feltes.
Yep.
Motion carries. Board and commission updates, none this evening. Department updates, none. Public hearings, we have none scheduled. Discussion and possible approval of amendment number 2 to solid waste disposal agreements. Bill?
Sure. So currently we have a solid waste disposal agreement with LaCrosse County, to use what used to be called the NSP, now Excel Energy, we call it the RDF facility in LaCrosse County landfill. The current contract, goes out to June 30th, 2023. Recently, LaCrosse County had negotiated an agreement extension to use that facility to June 30th, 2030. With an option, with two options, one to extend to 2035 and then 2040 thereafter. And so what they need to do for the amendment to continue and to certify it is to have all of their members sign the amendment number 2 here and return it to them. I do have an updated version. There's some grammatical corrections that we've made and requested of LaCrosse County, and I can go through those. So this is the most recent version.
So the one on here is.
The one on there is old, and I can walk through that with you. So the first change is the title. As you can see, it says Amendment 2, number 2, to solid waste disposal, and we just got rid of the first 2, T-O.
Oh, two.
Yeah. And then in the third paragraph where it says whereas LaCrosse and City of Arcadia amend the agreement on April 3rd, 2002 and extend the terms until June 30th, 2023. In that sentence, we change amend to amended, extend to extended, and terms to term, plural or single. In the fourth paragraph, where it says whereas LaCrosse and City of Arcadia desire to again amend the agreement to coincide with the new term extension negotiated by LaCrosse and Northern States Power Company of the continued use of the RDF facility in LaCrosse County. We added of between use and the in the last line there. The next paragraph, now therefore it is agreed by and between the parties that for good and valuable consideration and to the effect of the above, I believe we left in the effect. Under number 1, termination date, let's see here, the term of the agreement shall be extended for an additional 7 years beyond the June 30, 2023 termination to a new termination date of July 30, 2030 with 2 possible 5 years extensions if agreed to June 30, 2035 and June 30, 2040 if agreed to by the parties. We got rid of the first if agreed. Number 2, regarding disposal credits, in the event that the landfill disposal credit exceeds the annual payment of 2023, the credit may be carried forward during the remaining term of this contract. We changed that to agreement, including any extensions to be utilized for any future charges throughout LaCrosse County for the household hazardous waste program. And then in number 3, the last change here, all providers, we changed that to provisions of the solid waste disposal agreement between LaCrosse and City of Arcadia as amended by the amendment number 1 dated April 2002, where not not inconsistent with amendment number 2 shall remain in full force, etc. So you read the rest of it, there was no changes to the rest of it. So essentially what this does is it extends our current contract 7 years. And there are some changes in the agreement which was included in your packet about what type of materials you can drop off, and Bob, if you have it here. That included, fly ash disposal, tram material and bottom ash fees, excess waste fees, bulky waste disposal charge, and certain language in regards to that, but otherwise, there's not much liability for the city. And we had Terry review it, and he agrees with that, so. There we are.
So moved.
Motion by Feltus.
I just had,
Go ahead, Bob.
go ahead. Get
No,
your
go ahead.
motion and second first.
Yep, we got it.
Okay. Are we going all the way out to the end, or are we gonna go to 2030 and then look at 35 and 40 at a future date?
It goes out to 2030. and
Okay,
then-
so that's what we're gonna vote on tonight?
Right.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Okay.
There are other communities that are doing the same thing, and that's what's kind of pushing us a little bit too.
Correct.
Right.
Any other discussion? Clerk will call the roll.
Can I verify who seconded that motion?
Fetch. Sorry.
Olsted,
Yes.
Slusher?
Yes.
Fetch?
Yes?
Feltes?
Absolutely.
Wojni?
Yes.
Motion carries. Item 8B, discussion and possible, action on resolution 2018-2, resolution authorizing the issuance and sale up to $3,274,122 water system revenue bonds, series 2018, and providing for other details and covenants with respect thereto and approval of related $3,774,122 financial assistance agreements.
We'll move.
Motion by Feltus.
Second.
By Wojni.
So this is the financial assistance amount for well number 7. It was approved by the utility commission at their last meeting. The reason you see a difference in the two numbers is that the financial agreement itself is a larger amount. With that, there is a $500,000 public assistance forgiveness as part of the agreement, and which would then bring the revenue bonds to the $3,274,122.
Utility commission approved.
Correct. Any questions, comments? This is for wall number 7. Hearing none, clerk will call the roll.
Slusher?
Yes.
Fetch?
Yes?
Feltes?
Yep.
Wojni?
Yes.
Olsted?
Yes.
Motion carries. Item 8C, approval of police department general donations accounts.
So moved.
I apologize, this agenda item was actually on the special agenda, just a few weeks ago,
Yeah.
so we don't need to approve it twice, so.
Just didn't know what I thought.
We'll just, I was looking at that today and I looked at the minutes and I'm like, don't need it twice, don't need 2 accounts.
Kind of looks familiar. Maybe there's somebody.
So I didn't hear the motion. Discussion approve, possible approval to change agent of record to Gerald Denboer for health and vision insurance.
So moved.
Motion by Fetch, is there a second?
Second.
By Feltus. Questions or comments?
It's a liability.
I think because they're no longer an agent, and if it would stay on there, correct?
I'm sorry, I haven't had cold, so I did not hear the question, Marlis.
The question is, the change is requested due to liability?
Yeah, when we first went to WEA Trust 2 years ago with the Wisconsin Consortium, Jerry Denboer didn't have an existing relationship with WEA Trust, so we actually went, it was another person that we went through. But now, he's got other, he's brought other customers on and he's able to get a contract, so really he's the agent of record, so for liability reasons, now that he's able to have that contract, we need to change and update the name.
Thank you, Angela.
Clerk will call it roll.
Fetch,
Yes.
Feltes,
Yep.
Wojni,
Yes.
Holsted,
Yes.
Slusher.
Yes.
Motion carries. Item 8D, review and possible approval of the 2018-19 officer card.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Feltes, second by Fetch.
What is this?
Please.
Oh, that's just the city,
We just wanna make sure that
Yes.
we'll need to
Todd on
add,
there?
we'll need to add Todd Fetch onto that.
economic development. In other words, that's usually on a card or a card stock.
Yep. Is there any other changes? Anything you saw?
Called that kind of an officer. No. I thought it was police.
I thought you were talking about military officers.
Yes, the military besides.
Hearing none, clerk will call the roll.
Feltes,
Yep.
Wojni.
Yes.
Holsted.
Yes.
Slusher.
Yes.
Fetch.
Yes.
Motion carries. Item 8F, presentation, discussion, and possible action regarding air quality report results from City Hall and the Arcadia Public Library.
Can we hold off on that? The library board's coming at 5.
Sure.
So can we
You bet.
maybe go through the rest of our items and,
That sounds awesome.
actually, don't go to maybe don't go to closed session, but.
There's a work to do, there was a problem.
One to number 9A, approval of bills of general account in the amount of $257,018.50.
So moved.
Motion by Feltes, second by Slusher. Questions?
I had a question on the, on Davy and the riprap thing. That's just for their engineering and all that sort of thing, or what?
Correct. They haven't
Church Creek riprap, yeah.
Correct. So, we don't have any construction amounts yet, but, I mean, as far as invoices, all the invoices coming from Davy would be related to engineering and permitting.
Okay.
Any other comments?
Thank you.
Questions?
Could I add a couple?
No.
We're better at taking them off. We don't have to pay as many, and we don't have to spend money.
You had approved some trees for Ziegler's Landscape, Rob, and
Yep.
then, you know, we've been working with Raleigh on that. And, it's a smaller nursery that holding on to $10,000 till the next meeting might, you know. So
Okay.
that bill is $10,845. $4,700 is budgeted in the current year budget, and then we do have a tree fund that has, you know, the proceeds from the sale of the firewood and the trees that were taken down over the winter. The remaining funds will come out of the capital projects fund. So if we could get approval, we won't actually mail the check until Raleigh signs off and tells us that he's gotten all the trees, but we want it kind of ready to go. The other invoice, there was a Davy invoice that somehow got missed. It's dated April 19th, we just don't want it to be late. It was for the US Army Corps feasibility study in the amount of $3,401.10.
They forgot to send it, did that, or what?
No, it got missed getting put on the bills of general account list for the last meeting.
Or just got overlooked, or whatever, that's another
Yes,
word for it.
Yeah.
Angela, can you give us that totals? once more?
$3,401.10.
Okay, thank you.
And Ziegler's was 10,845 what?
10,845 even.
Okay. Is it okay with the motion and the second to pay those two bills?
Sure. Who seconded it?
I think they did, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yes. Any other questions? Clerk will call the roll.
Wojni.
Yes.
Holsted. Yes. Slusher.
Yes.
Fetch.
Yes.
Feltes.
No.
Motion carries. Item number 10, operator licenses, we had none this evening. Picnic permit for Ashley for the Arts.
So moved.
Motion
Second.
by Slusher, second by Feltes. Guess you wanna sell beer, huh, Jason? You don't do it anymore.
I'll be drinking. What do we think?
Is there any comments or questions?
Thursday.
Clerk will call the roll.
Olmsted,
Yes.
Slusher,
Yes.
Fetch,
Yes.
Wojni,
Yes.
Feltes.
Yeah.
Motion carries. Future agenda items, Mr. Slusher.
I have nothing.
Mr. Fetch.
Nothing new.
Feltus.
No.
Wojni.
Maybe next time.
Nothing new.
A simple no at this time.
No at this time.
Just make everybody laugh. Future meetings, regular meetings scheduled for Monday, May 21st at 5 o'clock right here at City Hall.
I thought we had a meeting Wednesday, the 9th, but that's a future meeting, ain't it?
Those are.
From tonight, with the
Oh,
utility?
yeah.
Yep.
Well, that was
Yeah.
this too, you know, you can't
Yeah.
rely on your
Sorry.
clerk. There's a special meeting on Wednesday, on the bid, bid opening, but I think actually, yeah, so that's at 4:30 here at City Hall with the Utility Commission. And then, I guess there's some discussion because there's a speaker coming on the 21st, how do you wanna handle that?
And that's at 6 o'clock, correct? 6 till 8, I believe.
What page you have that?
Is that in the?
Yes.
The first one?
I think that's 4 to 6.
Four 4:30.
4 to 6 on
Council and utility.
Yep.
So it's up to you guys how you wanna handle it. Does anybody plan on attending? And Utility Commission, have you heard from anybody from them? Otherwise, we'll just hold our meeting as scheduled at
Well,
4:30.
the 21st would be our regular council meeting, the Utility Commission meeting
Oh,
is this
4 to 6.
Wednesday at 4:30.
Is anybody from here planning on attending that in Whitehall? Otherwise, we'll just hold our council meeting on that Wednesday.
Which meeting and
I've
what?
had my share of motivational speakers.
Okay, we will just hold our meeting.
And there is a meeting on the 30th for negotiations.
Correct. Union negotiations.
The 9.
Takes care of that. So nothing else has changed.
So we can, we'll just, stay in the recess until the library board shows up.
Bill, make me a copy of that. Johnson, how are you?
Cause we gotta go into closed session.
We don't have to, we'll just put it on there just in case we need to.
Oh, that is a closed session.
Right.
So then all of 8 is not done yet? Well, then, Michael, Mayor, air quality, all of 8 is not done yet?
And then don't forget, if you're on the board of
We got F, G,
review,
and H.
to be here on the 16th, 4 o'clock.
Todd and Marlis. Adam, you're on standby.
I'm on my toes, you know that.
The 16th, I gotta be at the town hall. Right? Ambulance board, don't you?
No, we said
Board of review, City Hall, May 16th,
library board.
No.
I think that's you and Marlis and Adam's an alternate.
On that 7:30, I got,
Yeah,
We won't keep you past 7:30,
thank you,
we'll be out of here at 6:01.
6:01.
and a half.
You've done this
Tomorrow
before.
we have a council meeting?
This is the one the first time we did
Yeah.
2 different times,
Yeah, I'm
you know,
planning on
each
coming.
time in one day.
Yeah, oh, yes, I do remember that.
And then we shortened it
And we
to
can
just
still have
do
it,
one
it's just
2-hour
right,
period to
right.
match state
Are
statute.
we gonna get it down to 1 hour?
Well, if they change the state statute, we could do it at 1
What is
hour,
it?
but until then,
Until then, we gotta do the 2 hours.
correct.
I have to take that up with the city administrator, he put it on.
City administrator, that one?
Air quality, donations, legal.
No, if we say something wrong, it goes in the paper, what if the reporter says something wrong?
A letter to the editor?
The foul mouth reporter painted our meetings. Really kind of fun too.
I think we've all here heard a lot worse than that.
Yeah, I think so.
Marlon.
I'd like to see what Andrew says in that.
Because we will limit 3 because of
Plus the
COVID.
fact that I don't think Bill was even offended.
You said he's in the hospital? We're just talking about the meeting tomorrow, if we can move it, if we can move it up.
Yeah. Oh, I suppose we can't now because it's been
Wednesday?
Yeah,
tomorrow.
tomorrow at 3 o'clock.
It's scheduled
Oh,
for.
Yeah, it's too late
It's
because
already
it's
Tomorrow's
not.
3 o'clock.
Okay.
I just
At
got
3 o'clock in the
calendar
evening.
here, but I
The
don't-
Wednesday one.
Somebody eat it,
Hey, wait till you-
4:30.
You made me a copy.
or? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah.
Who then?
The only thing is. They're all day.
When did he go in?
He called me about 8:30.
Where's that, lacrosse?
Sounds like it.
Let me go grab my laptop.
So I told him I'd call him tonight, see what he.
Just know that. Right, just 'cause, you know.
No fun.
Okay, do I need to come with anything for it?
It says discussion.
No,
I suppose you will be ready for discussion. If you just jump at the same time.
Bye, guys.
There's a lot going on, right?
Is that
Carla.
good
Right.
stuff?
On Facebook Marketplace,
Yeah,
there's a lady in Minneapolis selling quilting fabric, cotton, for $1 a yard
are you serious?
on a estate sale.
So where is it at?
It's in Minneapolis.
Oh, so you have to go up.
Go to Facebook Marketplace,
Okay.
Sit in it and share,
and
and then.
Do you have to do Facebook Marketplace Minneapolis or just Facebook Marketplace, that's the name of it?
do Facebook Marketplace and then type in quilting stuff.
Okay. Good to know, thank you.
It's tough, you know.
So you're into quilting?
My wife
We'll
is.
find out where we're at.
Kinda takes me to the quilting shop when she wants something expensive.
You know, big fry on your
Like
dime.
an embroidery sewing machine the first time,
Apparently you can.
surgery.
If the governing body has an
How
act
about
on
gold?
it,
Well,
Trimming.
there's apparently a
Around
state
the
law
edges
that
and
says
stuff like
for you
that,
to
or
resign
none
officially,
of
it's
that.
Oh.
because you have to give it to the sheriff first, and he didn't do that. And so
We've
in the
got some
interim,
old
he discovered
quilting
that he changed
frames
his
up
mind.
in our attic.
So now he's back on the
If
board.
anybody needs any,
I
right?
don't,
So that
I don't
means
think
it's
they
gonna
do
get
that
built
anymore.
outside
Oh,
Whitehall.
don't they?
That was, I think when they did it by hand,
Yeah.
maybe the Amish
Well,
did.
They still don't do it by hand, they don't poke through and do the thing. and-
No, you use a sewing machine.
Not everybody, the ones at church do it by hand,
County or.
Yeah, they've got
so
some.
they need a
There is bananas.
What do the church ladies do?
By the water
Huh?
tower.
What do the church ladies do? They do it
That's
by
what I'm
hand?
talking about.
You
They
tie, you tie.
They tie them.
They tie them in.
Where would you like to present from?
Yeah, why did they buy that land in the first place?
that was pretty smart of them though.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh,
Well, I think they.
Did she make her copies yet, or
Get
what?
out to the
Well, she's got them in her hand, she just hasn't gotten them here yet.
healthcare
Calendar?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, Bill just
Yeah.
handed it to me, he didn't tell me who it was for.
Oh. I get the folder.
That's right, I forgot.
Highway department
Thank you.
right there.
Yeah.
I get. Piece of what folder?
Look at her.
Is that Maddie?
Seven, yeah,
No,
seven.
that's a.
Need to update a little bit there, Bill.
Yeah, I got 2 kids now.
Somebody's gonna be getting jealous of that.
You know?
Does one of them feel slighted that they're not on?
He doesn't know yet.
Yeah, being the key word there, right?
I don't know, but she'll say she could use the Hershey chocolate bar.
Got a couple more years before she knows.
You wait till they can start switching the backgrounds themselves.
Yeah.
Right? It's pretty good on a on an iPad.
Maya got a new pet.
Yeah.
A ball python.
Oh, yeah?
I was the last.
I was gonna ask you, when did you sign off on that one?
They tell Grandpa last.
That would've never got Grandpa's approval.
So,
It was me.
She would've looked at you, Bob, and you'd have said yes.
Jason worked in public relations. Oh, library.
so I just said, it's not coming in our house.
Do we have anybody else coming from the library board?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
We'll give them a couple more minutes and then we can move on.
I don't think Jenny will be coming.
Bill, you sitting here again?
Yes, I will.
Unless you don't want me to, Bob.
No, I do, you don't know how much I do.
But you wanna push that button.
You can't go along with mom or what?
It probably is your next slide right here.
Well, I can slide down and move into this, right?
Right.
I'm just saying, a mother is
We'll give them just a
happy
couple
as
more
used to
minutes.
have a
Sure,
child.
not,
There might
no
be-
problem.
Mom's happy,
I'm good.
we're all happy.
Parking problems over there.
Did you graduate?
Where's she going to school?
I know, Joe, I know, we don't like this.
Hey, you're the one that said you wanted to get out of here early. I'm not holding anything up.
Unless you wanna have
Oh, I'm under pressure.
I didn't know if I should bother you.
I'm gonna
No,
go
but it might be late, you know, because she works.
Right.
I'm sorry, but I'm sorry.
Well, they said I need a
And then
vowel,
back
so
on
that when I write it down.
Gavin Road, and then about 32 minutes.
They always think it's
You know,
about
Samir
size.
And I try to
Sure, you can go
I've been, now with these,
Yeah.
with this weather like this, I'm gonna try and roll over in the morning.
I'm like really passing to be gone. All the hard work.
Hard as nails.
We're gonna vote on
They were monking with those houses up there between the two diamonds. That's where we are.
We're gonna vote on the head property.
Oh,
Yeah,
actually,
there's
it's
a
trees.
page on the other page over.
I know you got here late as you need, but you just let me know. I don't know if you want to.
For those of you who don't know, we have a little rat infestation problem in our compost pile.
Yep. Out of order.
Up in,
But that's a product.
Raleigh
that
thing?
Yeah.
Mayor,
oh, so we're up there for red.
Mike has something to add as a public comment. He wasn't here when public comment was our house.
Just to let you guys know, we're taking, Dave Hesh came up here at our last town meeting and asked to rezone some property in the town as industrial, and that property abuts up to the city property lines. And so we're gonna vote on that on Thursday of this week.
Okay.
And, Bill and I had talked on the phone, and we wanted to make sure in this, in the spirit of cooperation between the two municipalities or two governments over here, find out if you guys got anything going on in that area, anything to do with your comprehensive plan, or anything happening into the extraterritorial zoning. It's right above Todd's head.
That part
Yep,
of-
south of the racetrack.
That's where they're parking
Yep,
their
there's,
trucks, right?
not there, but the next lot down, right there, yep. See, it's where the Ashley trucks parked last year for
Yep.
Ashley for the Arts.
Yep.
This year, the county's asking him, he did a temporary rezone last year. This year, the county is asking him to rezone it industrial. And then that covers parking lots and something else, I think he said.
Yeah, but what about, Mr.
What-
LaPrairie
no
and their?
questions.
No questions?
Public comment.
Public comment, okay.
Yeah. So spirit of cooperation and communication, you know, that's gonna come up on Thursday night. We've had one presentation by Mr. Hesh, previous meeting, and our vote will be taken then. We have a choice of sending to the county letter of support, letter of no support, or a letter of do what you want.
Cause the county runs
They run our zoning.
They run the zoning.
Yep.
So if there's a rebuttal or if there's something that you would like to say in regards to that, the best place to do that would be
At the town meeting,
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock, town hall,
Thursday night.
Thursday night, yep.
And Trumbull County also has the hearing yet.
And they still have to, approve that at the county.
It would actually go through the county
Department of Land Management,
and then the county board.
yeah,
For
probably,
rezone.
for rezone.
Okay.
All right?
Thanks, Mike.
Very good. All right, thanks a lot, guys.
You bet.
But anyways, getting back to the rat problem, one day next week, we're gonna shoot them when they're taking the stuff out.
Oh.
Just so,
What are you gonna do?
they're gonna shoot them.
And why wasn't I invited to this?
You can be.
Well,
Can we use what, shotguns or what?
You might not wanna put that in the paper. We'll have all kinds of people lined up at the city hall, at the city shop with guns.
The 357 Magnums or?
that might be overkill, Doc.
The camera is still on.
Well, we used to rat shoot down at Ashley.
Found the old dump at 22.
You bet.
You wanna call the library board?
That was a Friday night fun.
If anyone does not have a copy of the air quality report for City Hall and the library, they are up there behind that smaller TV.
Here's an extra
And
one.
Alva, do you wanna go ahead and call your meeting to order?
Yeah.
order for the portion of the city of Arcadia and the library board. Myers, Mary Jo is here. Karen and Amanda over here,
Okay.
halfway out the door.
Marlis.
Thank you.
And Marlis is here. Sharon, the floor is yours, if you wanna introduce yourself.
All right, sure. So I'm obviously Sharon Bessa, and I'll tell you a little bit about my background so you kind of know how I came to be doing indoor air quality stuff. My original education was nursing, and I worked as a nurse in a couple hospitals, Rhinelander, Madison, and then I took a job in a factory as a nurse. It was a furniture manufacturer. Ooh, not this one. It was a different one. I think, actually, it was Schweiger Industries. I think they're long out of business at this point. But they did upholstered furniture. Had 1,000 employees at one point. So I discovered I loved that kind of nursing, you know. So then I worked in a chemical plant for a while down in Kentucky, which was a whole different world. Came back to Wisconsin after a few years because I'm actually a winter person. I like the snow. And I worked for OSHA then, and I worked for 7 years for OSHA, and I worked in the program with OSHA that they have. It's called the consultation program. So I wasn't a compliance officer, but I was a consultant. And it's a great program for small companies to get their air sampling done, and they don't get a bill. So it's an awesome program. So I did that for 7 years, and I always say that's kind of where I really got my education. Learning how to be an industrial hygienist instead of a nurse. So when I started working with OSHA, I'm going to start out with some background and kind of a little bit on what things looked like in terms of indoor air quality surveys, because I kind of want you all to be in the same place before we talk about specifics here. So I'm going to talk about what happens during indoor air quality surveys, what can we look at, what our limitations are. And then secondly, I'm going to spend some time on mold, because we're going to have to talk about mold. And I want to make sure, again, that you're all in the same place, because there's a lot of very miserable misinformation out there. And then we'll talk about specific findings and recommendations for here. And then you should ask questions anytime you have one. I might tell you to hold off because I'm going to cover it, but feel free to jump in. So back in the late 70s is when we first started talking about indoor air quality. Before that, as an industrial hygienist, I was only going to factories. And so in a factory, of course, you expect there will be some air contaminants, right? There's a lot of welding, a lot of paint spray. People come to work, they expect that they're going to have some air quality issues, you might say. I've actually spent a lot of time up here. I was OSHA Nutrition before they were whatever they are now. And then I've also spent even more time at what was Cummins and is now Nelson Global. I've done a lot of sampling there, welding and paint spraying and all that sort of thing. So anyway, that was traditional industrial hygiene, and it wasn't until the 70s that we started talking about air quality in non-manufacturing buildings. Because our expectation was we would never do a survey in an office, because what's the issue there? Pretty clean environment, right? Pretty good air quality. Well, so then the 70s came, of course, and we tightened up buildings, and that's when we started to worry about stuff that was off-gassing and the stuff that people off-gas, starting to make buildings kind of stinky and some issues. So then the industry responded, the carpet industry especially, the paint industry responded, and now I can tell you that we have very few issues in brand new buildings with new stuff. It just doesn't look like it did back in the late 70s. So now we're still talking about, they're talking now about zero energy buildings, right? But now whenever that comes up, that's always coupled with, we got to be concerned about air quality as well. Because it's not just about saving energy, it's also about doing the right thing for people in the building, instead of getting carried away with just saving money for energy. So there are 3 types of indoor air quality surveys. The first one is proactive, where somebody calls me and says, hey, why don't you just take a look at everything, just get a good overview of kind of where we're at. The second type is post-renovations or post-construction. Most of my indoor air quality stuff is response to occupant concerns, 80% of them. come from people being worried about what they're breathing. Most typical thing I hear is I come to work and I sneeze. You know, and that's the most common thing that I hear. Many of them are odor investigations, which can be extremely challenging. So here, Angela called me and we talked about, well, kind of doing an overview. So it was a little more proactive. You'd had a couple of issues that came up with odors. And so this was kind of a quick look at the whole realm of indoor air quality and kind of to get an idea of what you might be dealing with here. So I spent a couple of hours at the library and I spent 2 hours here. And that's quite frankly in the interest of budget considerations, not to spend a week there, you know. So it was an overview of what's going on. So that's what we ended up doing. So normally in a building, when we look at people that have issues or concerns or symptoms, we have two different kinds of things that go on in buildings. The first one is building-related illness. That starts with a person who's got a medical diagnosis, who's sick, and says, hey, I think I got sick from the building. That person has a medical diagnosis that's backed up with laboratory or some other kind of objective findings. And then from that, we can say, this is exactly what this person's suffering from. This is the cause of that problem. Then we can go to the building and look for that cause. That's building-related illness. A good example of that is Legionella pneumonia. And I've done a couple of those investigations where somebody got diagnosed with pneumonia. Especially when two people get diagnosed, you kind of think, it's the building. So second one, so building-related illness is actually extremely rare, despite what what you hear from the media. It's very rare. We don't have that happen very often. Unfortunately now, and you may have heard from the news, Legionella is kind of starting to be more of a problem than it used to be. We thought we had that handled, and now we're having some issues again. So the other thing we're mostly dealing with is what's called building-associated illness. So people have symptoms in the building like the sneezing, but there's no diagnosis, or it might be just kind of a vague description of what's happening and not a solid diagnosis. So there is no laboratory test that says, this is why you're having this problem. So kinds of symptoms that people have, common upper respiratory stuff is the most common, headaches, sneezing, you know, a lot of allergy related stuff. And the problem with that is if Bill has a headache, he will tell me, I only have this headache when I'm at work and it goes away when I go home. That's real common. Well, can you think of all the things that might cause a headache here and not at home? Lots of things. Lots of things. And I'm not implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm not.
Maybe I wasn't a good example.
No. But you know, part of that might be, well, maybe it's computer, maybe it's your eyes, it's not the air. You know, so it gets to be very complicated. When people say to me, I have dry eyes in the building. Well, why would you have dry eyes in Wisconsin in February?
Because of the heat.
It's 6% humidity, right? And you're on the computer all day. So that's usually the kind of thing that we're dealing with. It isn't really cut and dried. So we're very good at taking samples and testing stuff. We're not so good at saying, this is the cause of your headache, and then eliminating it. All right. So that's giving you that big background. So the evaluations include starting out with what I'll call basic monitoring. So we look at CO2 levels, carbon dioxide, temperature and relative humidity. We get that as kind of background information. CO2 has become one of the most important things that we can look at in a building, because that's considered kind of a surrogate for all the air contaminants that might be in a building generated by people and generated by copy machines and printers and cleaning chemicals and all the stuff that people bring into the building. So we know that when there's a lot of CO2 in a building, because we are the source of CO2, and when we measure that and that's elevated, we know there's not enough outside air diluting the air contaminants. So we use it as a surrogate of all the other stuff was there. If you hired me to measure every single chemical that was in this building, you'd spend, starting out $5,000, and I can tell you that wouldn't give us answers to stuff, right? So we use CO2, and we say you have to have enough outside air in the building to keep CO2 levels down, then you're going to keep all these other things down as well. The kind of general stuff. Particulates are a big one, and this is a situation where lots of people have allergies, lots of people have a sensitivity to dust, and they don't even have to be allergic to that dust, but they've got airways that are sensitive, they're inflamed, they breathe extra dust, and they are affected by that. So in an office building, there are two different ways that we measure dust. One is I got a machine that measures dust by concentration, by weight per volume. So milligrams of dust per cubic meter of air. And that is not sensitive enough, because it looks good under all circumstances, just not sensitive enough. So I've started doing particle counts, which is what I did here. And particle counts are on the other end of that spectrum. They're almost too sensitive. But they do provide a better gauge of what's floating around in the air. All of that is affected by people and their activities, right? So then when we get to chemicals, the common ones that you might see are, that are sampled for are VOCs, formaldehyde. Those are the ones that are in new building materials and things like that. Other than that, it gets to be very site-specific. Probably the most common chemical that I get complaints about is diesel exhaust. You know, it's not unusual to have the loading dock next to the air intake in a building, and then, you know, you try to get people to shut their engines off, but they often don't. So I measure nitrogen dioxide as a surrogate for all the chemicals that are in diesel exhaust. So that's kind of how it works. We look for things that we can measure as a surrogate or an indicator of what's there. Otherwise, it simply gets to be extremely complicated to do the sampling for everything that's in diesel exhaust. We also look at biological stuff. Now bacteria, I don't very often do any kind of bacteria stuff. I have in the past, I've done some. There's a lot of bacteria in here right now. If I start sampling, we're going to get some high levels in certain areas. People are going to freak out, and it's all non-pathogenic stuff. It's stuff that's everywhere. The exception to that is, of course, Legionella. That one we look for, and we look for specifically Legionella. So mold. Do you guys have any questions so far? I'm giving you the 101 on. Well, before I move too far away from chemicals, I just wanted to say one thing. There are no exposure limits that apply in an office building. We have them that apply in factories that OSHA will enforce. But to give you an idea of what we're talking about level-wise, toluene is a very common, it's a solvent, it's found in different paints, it's found in my fingernail polish. It's very common. If I did a sample in here and, you know, ran it for a couple hours, I'd probably pick up very low level of toluene. It's basically everywhere. OSHA limit is 200 parts per million. If you're at 200 parts per million, you would leave immediately. You would not tolerate it. I've been at it once, and it is intolerable. So there's another organization there, ACGIH, it's not a government organization, it's a private technical association like NFPA, that comes up with recommended limits, and their recommended limit is 20. Now, because public sector employees get to choose, they're not under federal OSHA, the city and state and school districts fall under those recommended exposure limits. So ACGIH updates their stuff. So ASHRAE, I don't know if you know, ASHRAE does a lot of work on indoor air quality. They recommend 5 parts per million. Well, the odor threshold is 4.7 as an average. So if people came in and they smell toluene, they perceive that there's a real issue there. So even that is not acceptable in an office building. So just kind of give you a perspective on what we're dealing with number-wise. OSHA standards would not be applicable in a non-manufacturing environment. They're still the legal ones for private industry. ACGIH is the legal one here, but I can tell you if you're at 20, you'd leave the building. So it's kind of out of line with what we're really willing to tolerate, just in general.
Where the Diller standards stuff?
They're the ACGIH.
That's the
Yep.
Diller, okay.
Diller or whatever they call themselves now. I still think of it as Diller, but I think it's
Okay.
workforce development or something like that, but yes, they
Alright.
would enforce ACGIH.
Okay.
Yep. So what happened is when OSHA was first started, they had to choose, what are we gonna enforce? So they picked the 1968 ACGIH limits. And most of the OSHA stuff is still 1968. It's criminal, I mean, it really is, but don't get me started on the soapbox. You have a question?
Comment about smells. If you walk into Dairyland Lab, and if you're not used to those kind of chemical smells, they use a lot of toluene, benzene type of products when they're doing the soil testing and the plant testing and all that. So if you want to get that kind of smell, we don't have it here.
No.
But you have it, you notice it.
Or you could paint your fingernails.
Yeah.
That would give you that toluene smell.
Anybody's been in organic chemistry, I mean, I've had
Oh, yeah.
plenty of organic chemistry.
Yep.
And I know what those smells are.
Yep.
Mhm.
Wicked.
Mhm.
All right, so then biological, we just got started on that. So with mold, there are 5 steps for looking at mold and there are 8 challenges. So the first step is getting a good building history. And the challenge with that is trying to find out where did the water come into the building. And I might be coming in a year or 2 after the flood, right? That's not unusual. And the challenge with that is getting an accurate building history. So I always kind of ask around, I ask several people, and every once in a while I luck out and I find the building historian, person who's been there a long time, kind of knows all the. I start out with 1 or 2 water intrusions and I end up with 3 or 4. So that's my challenge, to try to figure out, if this building had some leaks, where were they? So then, an accurate answer to how long did the material stay wet is the second challenge. Because people don't often remember. Well, I ask, what did you do when that flood happened? Did you just sop up the carpet, or did you open up the wall and try to dry out the wall, or how did you respond to that? Because that's critical in terms of whether or not there's likely to be a mold issue there. The second thing is knowing something about building structure. And we'll look back on this when we get to some specifics about your buildings. It's important to know what's in that wall cavity. What's behind this wood? Is there wallboard there? Is it just wood? Is there insulation there? Is there a vapor barrier? You know, what's going on inside that wall? So accurate data on building structure is challenge number 3. The other thing that's important to know is where would the water go? If you had a leak somewhere, what's the pathway and where would that water run? What are the vapor retarders? Vapor retarders are vinyl baseboard and vinyl wallpaper. Those are the 2 most important and most common ones. They prevent the wallboard from drying when it gets wet, or from drying fast enough. So the third thing then is visual inspection. And that's just going there and looking for the mold. So you want to do visual inspection without increasing contamination. So this is the kind of visual inspection you don't want. You don't want somebody to rip all the wallboard off or wallpaper off, because now we've just spread a whole bunch of mold spores around. So it's tricky to do a really good inspection without causing additional problems. I had a mold job last week in a dialysis clinic. And there's tons of water in a dialysis clinic. There are tons of fixtures, and they all leak. I've been in other dialysis units. The stuff leaks all over the place. It gets into the wallboard and it grows mold. And so I'm very careful about trying to do an inspection in there. We did it after the patients were gone. And so I got to some point and I said, look, you know, I don't want to tear open anything else under these circumstances. So that gets to be tricky in doing a thorough inspection. So the question is, when do you open a wall? So it depends on how confident you want to be that you found all the mold, or you can just assume, based on what you know about water history and the structure of the building and what's in that wall, sometimes you can simply assume, whoa, we probably got a problem in that wall. Other times, an example of being confident that probably there's not a problem is if I pull the baseboard back and there's a nice gap between the slab and the wallboard. Because then if there was that flood, it didn't wick up the drywall. And newer buildings now are required to have that, but older buildings, And the challenge with that too is I'll go along for 6 feet and it'll be a gap and then I'll lose it. So the next thing then is environmental sampling, and the challenge there is that everybody loves samples, everybody wants samples. People want stuff from the laboratory. And generally now with our mold inspections, if we see visible mold, we say, hey, we got our answer here, there's a mold problem. You know, put your money into fixing it. But most of the time people want some kind of numbers. And the challenge with that is samples have serious limitations. What we're trying to do is capture spores, and the lab is going to call them colony-forming units. I don't know, but they're spores. So the spores may not be airborne during my 10-minute sample, because they can settle down, and then you go like this, and now they're all over the place. Or somebody walks on the carpet, and now they're airborne for a little while. Some people say, well, why are you worried about if there's mold in a wall cavity? So what? It's in the wall cavity. Well, how would mold spores get out of a wall cavity?
Pressure gradients.
Building pressure changes, you bet. And so that can make a difference in what's airborne. It'll come out of the outlets. If you got mold up here, it'll come out of these, between the frame and the tiles. So a mold spore, to give you a perspective, my hair is about 50 microns in diameter, and a mold spore is 2 to 10 microns. So it can, you know, and if water can run under the baseboard, spores can roll out. Okay. So the next challenge, then number 7, is interpreting the sampling. What we're looking at when we look at the mold sample results, and we'll look at your results here in a little bit, I want to see if your rooms look like a typical room that doesn't have a mold problem or doesn't have a water history. So all I'm doing is saying this is acceptable because it's typical. We have no exposure limits for mold, and we're not going to have any, in part because the health effects are very individual, whether you have an allergy to mold or not, whether you have immune suppression or not. So we're never going to have exposure limits for mold. So we have to look at what does a typical room look like, what's the expectation, and that's what we compare it to. So the lab does 2 things. I pull a sample onto a sticky filter, they stick it under the microscope, and they count the spores, and then they identify them. So our assumption, if everything's normal, there are no water issues in a building, mold spores are going to come in from outside. If you have decent filtration on your air handling unit, they're going to filter those spores out. But every time the door opens, or if you can open a window, you can open that window, I guess, the mold spores are going to come in here. They come in on my shoes, they come in on your clothes and your hair, they're just kind of everywhere. So if we're assuming that the mold spores that I find in a building are from outside air by that method, then those samples should look like outside air, right? The identification of the mold in the building should look just like what I identified outside. So that's how we make that comparison. So the other big challenge is dealing with inaccurate information. I talked a little bit about that earlier, about there's so much out on the internet about people getting every kind of health effect you can possibly think of. And Ed McMahon's dog died, you know, from mold exposure back during the mold frenzy. There's all kinds of crazy stuff out there. Black toxic mold, and I've had people calling me saying, we have black toxic mold. I'm like, that's a media label. That's not a scientific term. So finally we look at occupant symptoms. That's our 5th step in the evaluation. So there are 3 types of health effects. The first one, and the scary one that is in all the weird internet sites, is mycotoxicosis. So these are chemicals that are released by mold. The third one is allergy, and the last one's infection or invasion. So there are mycotoxins. Mushrooms produce these chemicals that are poisonous. We know that if you eat bad mushrooms, you can die, right? There's no controversy about that. The question is, can you breathe in enough of these chemicals to have these effects? So all of this started when they noticed in Cleveland that there were 10 premature babies that had bleeding in their lungs. CDC got involved in this, and they looked at the homes, and they realized that all the babies were all from homes with water damage and mold, and there was a specific kind of mold called Stachybotrys, which happens to be black. They noted that, calculated that the risk of bleeding in those babies' lungs was 1.6 times greater when a mold was present. So then this made a headline, and the media started calling it black toxic mold. After further study, they looked a little more at the data, and they realized that the risk of bleeding was 8 times with exposure to tobacco smoke. So the real issue was cigarette smoke, but that didn't make a headline. The mold frenzy was off and running, you know, and it was horrific for a while. So after extensive research, and I mean by some really big organizations, very reputable, Institute of Medicine, the Occupational and Environmental Physicians, large, reputable professional organizations studied, can we get sick like that from breathing mold spores? And their conclusion is there should be no health risk of inhaling mycotoxins because they're not very volatile. And the only way you would get exposure is if you breathed the spores. And by calculating how much you could breathe in each spore, you'd have to breathe so many spores you couldn't possibly do that as an adult. So they concluded this mycotoxicosis shouldn't happen in adults from inhaling spores. Now, you can eat bad mushrooms and die, but not by inhaling. I think, because I looked at that data and looked at it, it's a dose response kind of thing, right? I think if you're a premature baby, there is concern based on that small size, but not as adults. We can't inhale enough. So that kind of finished that question. So the second thing then is mold allergies. 4 to 5% of people have a mold allergy. When I take an air sample in a room, I often find 10 or 12 different kinds of mold that the labs identifies. Now, when you have allergy testing done, the typical kit that's bought at the clinic varies a little bit from clinic to clinic. Most of them have 4 molds that they're going to test you for. And we have over 60,000 different types of mold, and like I said, in a typical room, I pick out 10 or 12 in an air sample. Outside, it's even worse. I can come up with 20 different kinds of mold. So allergy testing, just like my air testing, has a lot of limitations. So you can be allergic to mold even though your allergy test says you're not. The scarier thing for me is infection or invasion of mold and having it actually grow in your lungs. And aspergillus is the kind of mold that is capable of doing that. Aspergillus is one of those that is smaller. It's on the 2 micron size, so it's easily inhaled. And because it's smaller, it's going to float around in the air a lot longer. And it also doesn't need a lot of water to grow. It's typically the mold that grows when you have wet drywall and the water starts to wick up into the gypsum. The gypsum's not going to grow mold. It's the cellulose covering on that wallboard that's the food for mold. And it kind of goes up like this in the shape of a tree. And as it gets up into this area, there's not as much water in that wallboard. And only a few mold will grow there, and aspergillus is one of them. So that's the scary mold to me, not the black toxic mold, it's the aspergillus. So people who have immune suppression are at risk. Okay, any questions before we look at the specific stuff? Okay, so at the library, I don't know how many of you had a chance to look at the report ahead of time. Picture up there on the upper right is I didn't peel that wallpaper back, it was already, I didn't rip it off there. It was already kind of starting to lose its adhesion to the wall. And that's also what happens when the wall gets wet, that adhesive is water-based, it starts to not hold the paper up against the wall anymore. So that's all mold that you see there. And so when I see that, my question then is, how extensive is that? And I wasn't going to tear that whole, you know, it's not appropriate to take that wallpaper off. So we don't know. Sometimes in a wall cavity, you'll see this on the surface, and then the inner side of that wall cavity is perfectly fine. but I don't know. Does the water leak from that window also into the wall cavity and cause mold from the inside? I don't know. There's no good way to know that without opening the wall and looking, and that really wasn't part of my scope of work that day. I wasn't about to do that. The other reason that I think there may be more issues, and I wasn't able to really look at any other windows because you all know what your library looks like. It's all covered up with books, like it should be. But the photo on the bottom left, it came out looking very strange, but I'm taking a photo of the window with the screen on it, and you can see the water, beads of water toward the bottom. And that says there is some condensation issue there that may also contribute to the moisture. So the windows themselves might be leaking, or it might be some condensation that's also adding some water to that. Unfortunately, you know, that's plaster underneath there. And plaster just doesn't grow mold. I mean, I've been in lots of buildings that are plaster. A lot of the state buildings in Madison, they've been flooded 100 times, and the plaster starts to crumble, but there's not food in there. Now, you can get some food from the paint, but generally, plaster building is awesome, because you just don't have the issue. But you add vinyl wallpaper that has wonderful food on that adhesive, and then you slap that over it, and you confine the moisture to the wall. That's what causes the mold in that situation. You guys have any questions on this?
So paint is better.
Paint is better, yeah, because it breathes enough. It has enough, it's got enough breathability that it's gonna let the water dry.
Because wallpaper paste is wheat, rather, it's just basically carbon for the bugs to grow on.
Yeah, these are all kinds of organic chemicals. I mean, it's just good food for mold. So the basement then, how many of you have been in the basement? You know what it looks like? Okay. So when I first walked down there, this photo, again, looks like, whoa. My first concern was that if this was groundwater and rainwater, was it contaminated with other stuff? Like, I've been in basements that there was an old gas station there was an old dry cleaner there. The fire department in a small town in Wisconsin had that happen, and it was horrible. So that was my first fear when I looked at that. I'm like, it looks like an oily sheen on it. It's not. And I kept looking. There is no oily sheen on that water. And then I asked several people. I'm trying to find the building historian, right? I asked several people, was there ever anywhere near here, was there a dry cleaner, was there a gas station? Because my big question there was, should you be looking at that issue, groundwater contamination? And what I'm hearing is no.
The closest gas station would have been right across the street.
Right across the street from the library?
No, right here.
From here. Oh, okay. So I think we're safe.
Right. Yeah.
I think
There
we're
was a gas
safe.
station right here.
It's right here, yeah.
No, I'm talking about the library.
Oh.
So you're
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
in the, near
Okay, so we can
vicinity-
worry about it here, but not at the library.
So you're talking about a cleaners like by the
Dry
same,
cleaner.
in the dry cleaners in the vicinity of the library? Okay.
Yes, yeah, like within the same block, or within an area where the groundwater would seep into the ground and then so I'm very happy to think, okay, that's not an issue. But obviously the water's an issue. There's not, that whole basement, it's, painted concrete, that's not good food for mold. I didn't see walls of mold down there. Where I did see at that bottom photo, if you're thinking, you gotta look like you're looking up at the ceiling of the furnace room. That small furnace room has wallboard on the ceiling, and that's got little gray splotches of what looks like it's heading toward breaking out and becoming mold. That's a nice, people always want to do that in basements, put the wallboard up, and then there's your food. So better to have that not out of there. I went through the storage room, I didn't see anything in there where all the things are stored. I don't know if you call it, I guess you call it the storage room. I didn't see any mold in there. This was the only visible mold I saw downstairs. But the fact that this is a damp basement, there's lots of references and lots of health studies that say that's not a good thing. people tend to have more upper respiratory infections. So one of the concerns I would of course have with the library is that you don't have people there for 40 hours a week, but you have employees in there for a long period. You know, I think they're both part-time or not totally 40, but still they're in there for long periods of time. And the other thing I saw as I was there that day, your population in there I don't think anybody was under about 80 when I saw, you know, the population coming in there and spending a fair amount of time. So I just think of elderly as, you know, that they're more vulnerable to, you know. What I consider elderly keeps getting older and older. I used to think 60 was older, but I don't think that anymore. But you know what I'm saying? That's a vulnerable population. So these are all things that you kind of have to end up weighing. What are we going to do about this? And your report was very difficult to write. I think I'm pretty good at writing technical reports. I'm not so good at writing reports people can understand when they don't do what I do. So I've made it a practice to come back and sit down with people and say, here's what I'm really talking about here. And, you know, at no added fee, it's part of my service because I want to make sure you understand and get some background and some sense of what's the risk here. So obviously I'm not saying, geez, you got to evacuate the library. I mean, that's not appropriate. But there are, there's clearly an issue that needs to be dealt with. And so you ask about Diller or whatever they call themselves now. They don't have OSHA doesn't have a standard. Nobody has a standard on mold, and there's nothing even close to that in Wisconsin. But what OSHA has done is there's a real vague sentence in the standards that talks about having a clean and sanitary workplace. They have used that to cite employers who had mold in their building. So I think if somebody was going to be, you know, kind of stretching it and kind of nasty, they could do that. And I need to tell you that just as a possibility. I mean, that's out there. Do you have any questions about this?
So this needs to get cleaned up right away, or?
Well, I think it should be done as soon as possible.
Okay.
Because I think that, again, let's look at.
What about cement board?
Cement board's better. The absolute worst is wallboard. And any time you make the wood chunks better or you make the material less able to be digested, it's much better. Like gypsum itself, for example, just isn't going to grow mold unless it gets dirty. You know the Dens glass that everybody's using now? They use it as exterior sheathing. That does not grow mold, but I have a photo of Dens glass with mold because it was on the bottom of the stack outside and it got dirty. So it's all about providing food. So just like cement blocks are not going to grow mold, but you add some dust to that, sometimes if you add paint can be good food. So this is what the air sample looked like in the library. The ground floor. So the numbers here, a typical building that doesn't have any issues, I expect mold spore count to be less than 500. Well, there you go. So this is a really good example of the limitations of my mold sampling. I know there's mold in that ground floor. I saw it. It's under the window. So that, I mean, it's really frustrating that that happens, but that's what happens. These look perfectly fine. They look like outside air, right? There's pretty much, each of those columns is a different kind of mold. So not to make that slide too complicated, but each is a different kind of mold. And so I look at the line that's outdoor air, I want to see pretty much that same kind of mold inside, and that's pretty much what happened there, in the same predominance. So that's all I did. I would say, hey, you're good to go, no problem. That's the problem with mold samples. That's why the visual inspection is so important. So no, I don't think you have to do anything like right now. I don't think you have to shut down the building. I think you have been given obviously notice now that there is mold there. You have to come up with a plan that gives you a reasonable amount of time to get it taken care of because it's not going to be easy. And I know some of you might be thinking, well, what about all the books in there? Well, yeah, they got mold spores on them. And there were some places in the mold frenzy where somebody would come in, the remediation company would come in and take all those books and HEPA vacuum clean them. No, don't do that. Outside, In October, the spore count is 20,000 and up. At some point in October, I usually take an air sample and they can't count it. It's too high to count. It's overloaded on my filter. So just to give you a perspective. It's very challenging and very difficult for anybody to claim my upper respiratory symptoms are from mold in your building because mold is everywhere. I had more attorneys calling me during the mold frenzy than I had other people because they all jumped on the bandwagon, and then they looked at a few cases and realized we don't have data to make a connection here. Okay. I did particle counts and CO2. Particle counts were not unusual. They looked like a normal office building. And the CO2 levels, we want to see them well below 1,000, and they were running in 600s and in that category. But obviously, both of those things have to do with occupancy, right? Because both of those things are going to increase the particle counts and the CO2, and it was low occupancy in there. It was just 3 of us and an occasional person visiting. So library recommendations, complete. So one of the things that just needs to be done is a complete mold inspection. And obviously that means literally emptying out that building, or at least moving the shelves out far enough to do an inspection. The second thing is obviously keep the water out of the basement. I'll tell you that. You're already, I think, working on some ways to do that. The other thing is the carpeting is really old. And carpeting is we call it a sink for stuff like mold spores and dirt and allergens and all kinds of stuff. Some people say, well, that's good, it traps that stuff. Yeah, it traps it momentarily, but the minute somebody walks on a carpet, I can see that with the particle counter. Now they're airborne. I did a brand new hospital down in Prairie du Sac. They built a new hospital, and I did the air quality. I did air quality before they moved patients in, and I did a particle count in every single room. I could look at my data now. This is a building that had not been entered yet by people. No one was there yet. And I could tell by looking at my particle counts which rooms had carpeting. So that will go a long way, getting some nice new fresh carpeting in there, and using a vacuum cleaner with a high efficiency filter. The filter on the furnace there is a good one. So it's a high efficiency April Air, very nice furnace filter. The other thing I was looking at in there, the building itself is too old to be worried too much about asbestos, but I looked at the ceiling tiles. They don't look original in any way, and so I'm just questioning. I'm just throwing that out as a possibility, and I don't know if you may have already done that, but people at the library didn't know for sure. And then I always, a standard issue, carbon monoxide monitor in the basement. Just because I run into carbon monoxide issues all the time. That's the other building-related illness. It's the most common one.
Sharon, what would you, I'm Elba Helligan, president of the library board. What would be a recommendation if we replaced the carpeting to help with that situation?
Ideally, if you didn't have any carpeting at all, it would be awesome. But then you run into issues with noise. So you always have to weigh that thing. So you'd want to get something that has a nice low nap, and then really critical after that is really good high efficiency vacuum cleaner, keeping it clean. Because again, the carpet by itself isn't going to grow mold or anything else, but it's when it gets dirty that's a problem.
Although, is there wood floors underneath that carpeting?
That was before I was
Oh,
born, so I don't know.
That would be awesome.
Well, you'll take it up and sand it down and.
Because that's going to be nice for noise. I mean, and not as bad as vinyl or something. Yeah, that's a great idea.
There probably is.
Yeah.
There probably is, and they probably
that
went
it's
into,
age.
I would gather, and my guess is that they did go to carpeting because of the noise.
Yeah.
Because, you're in a,
And you can also put area rugs down.
then you're.
Now I know your elderly are going to walk on the area rug.
I'm just
Yeah,
really
yeah.
worried about area rugs in a public place because you have somebody that can trip over them.
Yeah.
You still get dirty.
The minute I said that, I was thinking, oh, I picture my mother,
Yeah, you still gotta shake them out or bait them or whatever it is.
You'd still have to do that, yep.
How about thick rubber shoes for everybody that walks in the?
Yeah. Any other questions, discussion on the library? So what is happening with the basement? Is that, I know that when I was there, that was being kind of explored and trying to figure out where to go with that.
Well, I know that Raleigh was doing something with it, but I think it's currently on hold. But I think that's currently on hold for our discussion, our next discussion.
Okay.
We're getting a new library.
Well, that's what I heard. The fundraising and,
We're hoping,
yeah.
Yeah.
so, then it'll be a moot point if,
That's a beautiful building,
But
beautiful.
used for something else though.
Right. Yep. Okay, so on mold remediation, when someone comes in and does that, they should be doing it under containment, as if it were asbestos, negative pressure, air scrubbers. If that little piece of mold is all you had under that window and that was it, and I knew that, I would say go in there and, cover that up with a wet paper towel, tape it on with duct tape and cut around it, cut it out, you don't have to put the full-blown, negative air and scrubbers and everything in for that. And the thing is, might pull back the bookshelves and maybe that is all you have, best case scenario, I would look for other signs that there's moisture in the wall, which mean, the bubbling, you know what I mean by that. And then you might have to open the wall, cut a hole, and just see what it looks like. It's the only way you're gonna know. Okay, so we'll move on to City Hall. So there's mold in the, I'm calling it the attic, Bill, I don't know what else, but I knew you'd know what that meant by that. It's kind of an attic. It's an attic for some part of the building. Yeah, so that's that top right photo, and you can see the little rectangles across the top. That's that's where you can see the outside air coming in. There's water coming in, obviously, and there is some mold back there. It was hard to get back close enough to really get a close-up of the moldy material. That's that kind of cellulose insulation stuff. And again, that doesn't grow mold easily. You can have a lot of water leaks, and because it's kind of fluffy and there's no vapor barrier on top of it, there's nothing retarding it from drying, it'll dry pretty fast. And I've seen that stuff that's gotten wet and wet and wet and no mold, but that's saturated, and it seems to be kind of staying saturated. So that's not good. And it's, the rule of thumb is you have to dry stuff within 48 hours. I've never seen mold grow in 48 hours. It's gonna be usually more than 72 hours, but at some point that's gonna happen. So the lower right corner then is just a photo taken around the windowsill. Now, there may not be any mold there, but I don't know what's behind that paneling. Is it just nothing? Is it just the frame and just the wall cavity? Maybe. So maybe all of that dried enough that there's no mold inside there, but clearly wet issue. The one in the middle, you see the light, and then on the lower right corner of the light, there's a little, this is from out here, there's a little water stain there. That's the kind of water stain that looks like it might be from condensation on that metal frame for the light. I see that fairly often. That usually doesn't result in mold. Usually acoustic ceiling tiles, again, if nothing's preventing it from drying, it can get wet, it dries, it stains, it's ugly, but no mold. When it gets wet and wet and wet and wet and stays wet, then you get some mold on the upper side of the tile. So I don't know. I would guess that's probably not mold in that. And the lower is upstairs again, and that, again, I don't know what's behind that. It's clearly been wet. I don't know what is up above that. Is that stuff stuck to the wall with some kind of adhesive? I'm not sure. But I think a thorough look at that would be important.
Which room is that again?
That's the back storage room.
Oh, the straight up at the head of the stairs?
Oh, yeah.
Or is that the one where the ceiling tile fell down the other day? No.
No, that's not the one.
That's,
That's my office.
That's another issue.
So these were the samples here, now they look very different from what they look like at the library, right? So clearly I wasn't surprised about the second floor one. I'm calling it a conference room, Bill, because it's the conference room / office. So that's where I took that sample. In the occupied area, I didn't take one back by the attic. Nobody's working in there, and I know there's mold there. This is answering the question, are you getting some mold spores in that occupied area? So 1,700, that's about, 1,300 more than I would like to see there. That's clearly a number that's too high. The puzzling one was this one.
Which one?
The next one, 1,000.
Chambers?
Yeah. And before this meeting started, I was taking another look at this room, and I'm like,
Looks pretty nice.
it does. So we had a little ceiling tile that was open when I was here. So I'm just wondering, is there a pathway from, does it make any sense to you guys that there's a pathway from that attic area, or even the conference room upstairs to the other possibility, and what I never know, is somebody walked in, because we're already starting to get, there wasn't snow on the ground. We had that little period where it was kind of warm on March 8th. That's all it would take. It's on the carpet. Somebody walked in and I just stirred it up. But I think this has given, all of these examples have given you a good idea of how challenging it can be to get all the answers straightforward with mold. Because you can do the samples, you can do the visual inspection, and it just, sometimes it takes a little work to figure out what's going on. For the chambers, I would say do a couple of really good vacuums with a HEPA vac. I mean, I just don't see any source in here. I mean, even this window, looks pretty good. Police department office, that one looked fine. No, kind of looked like outside air. Close enough. You can't split hairs on this either. You kind of have to look at kind of the big picture. All right, any questions about mold before I leave that subject? Particle counts, again, same thing here, not unusual, but there was low occupancy, so I don't expect to see anything there. So other findings were, there were people reported the odor, and what's happened with the unused bathroom? We were kind of thinking maybe that was the sewer gas
I don't think
source.
anything's happened with it yet. I know that
Okay.
we had the water department look into it.
Okay. Yeah. Because I know the woman working right over here was really concerned about the odor, the sewer gas type odor, sulfur odor. And, there are only 3 things that smell like that: sewer gas, methane with the odor in, and a dead animal. I drove up here today with all my windows open because I have a dead mouse in my car.
Oh, wonderful.
Let it dry out.
I found 2 babies on Tuesday, and inexplicably I tried to keep them alive. Because I've spent a lot of time trying to keep mice away from my house. They didn't make it, but I think the sibling got into my air conditioner. My air conditioner doesn't work, and so I'm driving down, all my windows are open. It's a really nauseating smell, as you know. So the other puzzling thing was when I was measuring the CO2, that also measures carbon monoxide. And I got just in this office here, and I got a little blip of carbon monoxide. And I'm like, well, why is that? So then I thought, well, maybe it's the boiler. I thought, oh, the boiler's leaking. I went all over the boiler, there were no leaks there. Then I thought maybe the garage, but there had been no traffic in and out of there. The only other thing in the garage, you got some heaters in there, but as far as I could tell, they were not on that day, because this was a pretty nice, warm spring day. So I'm just saying, get yourself a good carbon monoxide monitor back in there and kind of stay on top of that, especially with the boiler there, especially with the garage right there. It's easy to miss it. And get a monitor that gives you a digital readout of the parts per million. There are 2 kinds. One that just alarms at 25 or 30, and one that gives you the digital readout, and then you can press it and it'll give you the highest peak over the last highest peak. That's what you want. There is what sure looks like asbestos pipe wrapping in that boiler. So that's kind of right up there. That's friable stuff, you know, that's something that really should get on your agenda to take care of pretty quickly. I'm not so worried about the potential. There's no issue with the ceiling tiles in the library until somebody drills a hole in it. But there are two places here, the asbestos pipe wrapping in the boiler room, which you really should take care of that pretty quickly. The other one is the bathroom upstairs has what looks like, I'm pretty sure that's asbestos tile. Not an issue until you do renovation and you tear it out. That one can just stay there. Again, use the vacuum with high efficiency filter, and then I'm not quite sure what, you know, the air handling units, you had mentioned that the people that service them are concerned about the
We're
condition
concerned-
of
Yeah,
them.
we're concerned about them not turning back on.
Yeah,
The old 1991.
so that's a big ticket item that, you know, after 30 years, that's, starts to get to be an issue. All right, any other questions, issues? So in summary, I think there are some old issues, a couple of asbestos things, carbon monoxide, get a monitor in both places, and then the age of the carpeting, I think is something that, including the carpeting, in some of the areas here. Any questions?
Any questions for Sherry?
Yep, we do.
Yeah.
For the library, should there be one in the basement and one on the main level, like
Yeah.
a CO2 detector? And how about at City Hall, one for each level?
Yeah, I would put one in this office especially because of
Like this
the
one or behind
proximity.
the door?
Yeah, but the proximity to all the sources, you know, there are 3 sources there.
Yep.
So I wanna make sure you have one in there and then one on upstairs. I have some cards here. If you have any questions, like you can feel free to email me. I hardly ever answer my phone because I'm usually out on a job. But I do respond to my emails and, or texts work. 'Cause I can usually sneak a peek at a text.
What do you think about having a rec center done? Put it in the budget for next year.
You have a checking thing, or
Oh,
especially the exercise rooms and stuff like that. The big area.
She was coming in on me.
okay. Watch your toes.
I watched.
Everybody's got
Start
their
watching
toes
you
over
when you
here.
walk over.
All right.
Is there any other questions for
I
Sherry?
understand, okay, I hear you.
If not, we'll move forward.
Thank you.
Discussion and possible, discussion of the public library donations. Jason, is something you wanna take over? Go ahead.
Well, where you want me to sit up here?
Wherever you want,
Okay.
Jason.
Just to give you, everyone here an update, when we started, this endeavor, I had made a promise to myself and to the library, board and the city council to do everything I could to get, the necessary funds from private donations for the library. And we're gonna know where we're at, for sure by probably about May 20th. That being said, there's there's 2 large donors, 2 of my list of, my most critical one, that I have not, had any luck with, let's put it that way. So, that's discouraging, of course. The other thing, but obviously I'm still following up with a few folks, so I'm doing everything I can. And we have a group of approximately 20 people that are trying to do fundraising for the library, and you've seen some of those materials, and the community center in general. We wanted to cast a wide net, see if we could get as many interested donors, and we thought that was in the best interest of the library. And those efforts have been, I think, going very well. the grassroots movement. Now, we still need a big donor to really be successful, we feel. The other thing that I've had in multiple discussions with the library board and others is that I found is, you know, there was always this talk of, you know, there's potentially some large donors available that will, as long as we have a location and a project, there's a real good possibility, there's been indication there's a really good possibility that there will be large donors toward the library. We have not seen that to be true as of yet. We're pursuing some of those individuals that have been rumored to support the library, and we're going to find out, you know, if they're indeed interested at all, or if they're not. So I hate to be gloom and doom, but we're doing everything we can, and I believe we're going to have some money to work with. I'll say one more thing that I've learned through this process is that you know, we have about 1,200 to 1,500 different entities on our target list, so to speak. And I would say that, you know, there's a lot going on, obviously. We all are aware of this. There's a lot of different fundraisers. And I wouldn't necessarily say that based on donors that a new library is at the top of people's priority list in many cases. So, you know, we're going to do a campaign, and we're going to send out a direct mail piece over the course of the next week that is going to basically be in big bold letters that the future of the library is in your hands. And there's going to be my phone number will be on there, along with the Education Foundation, which is where the funds would be provided. So there's going to be a little bit of information on there for that. But basically that's going to go out, and then there's going to be a date on there that, you know, we need your pledge. Now we're looking for his pledges right now by May 23rd. So so that's where this group of folks that are involved in this endeavor are headed. We're making phone calls because we know we need to call people to get responses. That's just the way it is with any fundraiser, or most any fundraiser. And sending letters and circling back. And over the course of the next 2 weeks, we should know where we're at.
Is there a question from the council? Go ahead.
Now, they're apparently, what is it, 1.5 million for the library?
Yeah, I mean, 1.25 will get us the building, so.
Get us the building, we will have the building already, because the facility is part of the building facility with the community center, right?
The, of the $16 million budget that we have to work with, 12 million was given by a private donor for
Right.
school and community center use. 4 million was toward the school only, and the school only piece is approximately 10 to 12 million of this project cost, depending on how you slice it. It's all shared between the school and the community center. So the library was never a part of that $16 million budget. That was always a 1.25 outside of that, relying on private donations outside of that budget.
So the structure is still not.
No, there wouldn't be there would not be a building that would be able to be occupied by
A library.
a library or anything else that would be.
Without
at
this money that
5,000.
we're raising.
Right. Mhm.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought, hey, it was all part of the plan, and then all we gotta do is come up with the money to furnish it and
The
all that
library
sort of thing.
board already has, I think, 250 to 300,000 set aside for technology and furnishings, and my goal was to, hopefully they allow them to use that toward that piece of the project.
Towards.
The furnishings and technology inside of the
Right.
library.
So we have that, but we don't have a structure yet.
Correct.
Yeah.
So would the structure just be built then and not finished inside?
They wouldn't build.
So they wouldn't even build that part of it?
Yeah, it would just be community
Okay.
center and school.
Okay.
Can I
I
interrupt
had
for a second?
misunderstood that.
Young man, can you introduce yourself to the common council?
Yeah, sorry. Kevin Lozano. I'm just a part-timer here.
You're not just a.
You're
Shining
star.
Goodness, you're welcome.
Sorry. I didn't want
That's
to
all
intrude.
A lot of people.
So when is the absolute deadline, Jason?
May 23rd would be the absolute deadline. We'll, our goal is to have an answer, and we should by at that point, May 20th, know where we're at, you know. And,
That's,
shoot.
that's the new guy, right?
Yeah.
Is your thumb programmed in
Let me
there?
knock on the door.
I don't think so.
I can let you.
We'll have to cover it.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
I'm gonna talk to the chief about that.
Yeah.
Poor guy.
So by the 20th, you think you'll have an answer whether if the library is a go or not?
Right, we've, in our discussions with everyone that we've been able to get a hold of, you know, we've told them that obviously want an answer sooner than later, but, you know, and for the major donors, of course, we're trying to give them time to work through their board of directors and whoever else they have to, but at the same time, we set a strict deadline on those pledges, so we'll know it by May 20th. We should know at that point, you know, what we have for donations, for pledges.
Do you know what you have now for pledges at this point?
Yeah, we have, you know, we have a number. I don't necessarily wanna give that number out, because I wanna, because the paper's here. But we've been relatively successful, and if you talk about it as a fundraiser, and as most fundraisers go, this has been a good, I think a good showing from a grassroots standpoint. However, we really need a big donor to make this thing happen, unless a bunch of pledges come in, and that's why we said to those who we targeted, you know, hey, if you're, as a family or as an individual, if you can come forth with a $5,000 pledge or more over a 2-year period, because if you look at it that way, 5,000 pledge, all we need is 245,000 pledges, not all we need, right? But it's a lot less than a $100 pledge, you know, so when you say $100 pledges, it's less. Now, we're taking less pledges, but we're really encouraging larger amounts.
Any other questions? Appreciate your efforts, Jason.
Yeah, no problem, thank you.
As long as you can keep us informed, because I'm sure the school will wanna know sooner than later, as well as the library board.
Is there a deadline for the school? Is that March, the May 23rd date?
Yeah, that's where we came up with that. We worked backwards from there, and we worked with HSR, the architect, and Myron, and they gave us a grace period, and the grace period is through May 23rd. So we had a deadline earlier than that, and I said, okay, give me a little bit more time so we can at least give this thing a real shot. And May 23rd is the last date. So we sure appreciate the opportunity, obviously, too, from the council's perspective. I know these issues aren't easy to vote on, and you know, the way I look at it is this is a great opportunity to see it's a referendum on our library, and we're gonna find out, you know, collectively if there's funding that's not just available, but willing to be given to this endeavor. So I appreciate the opportunity from your perspective too.
Thanks, Jason.
Yep, thank you.
Item 8H, discussion and decision on legal fees for the community center agreement. Do you wanna discuss that?
Yes, I would say the legal fees, paid to date are over $2,000. I'm sure if I went and grabbed the actual invoices, it's probably closer to $3,000 or $3,500. There wasn't discussion, you know, as we started this process, it seemed kind of, you know, time was of the essence, and we had to do it and everything, but that, you know, that's not something the city budgeted for. And, you know, I had mentioned it to Alba, so we decided that should probably come up to a meeting and, you know, is that something that should be part of the library budget?
What's your feeling, Alba?
My brain studied, sorry. It's been a long
That's
day.
all right.
I mean, I don't have an issue, you know, with absorbing the costs. I mean, we're both the same team.
Yeah, and
You
I
know-
think we all realize that, you know, that
You know.
we're all out for the common good, we know what the fees we're going for, and we have them, I mean, you know, we went to the meetings, we did a lot of work on it, you know. In essence, you know, the school, you know, they're kinda getting off scot-free, but they're also gonna have legal fees, cause they're gonna have their attorneys look at any agreements that are drafted and stuff like that, so.
I don't have any,
You know, if it's something that we can even just maybe split, I don't know what the council
That's what I
feeling
was
is,
thinking, do that.
pardon me?
kind of just split it.
That's fine. I'm in agreement with that.
Go for that, yeah.
Splitting?
Sounds good.
Okay. I think we're all in agreement.
Probably get that on a motion.
Is there-
We have to do
we
it
have
on
a-
a different meeting, or?
Nope, it's on here.
Oh, okay.
I'd entertain a motion to have a split legal fees
So moved. Second.
by Fetch,
What if we
second by
don't,
Slusher.
what if we don't get a builder, a space to a library and?
Well, let's
what-
wait for that.
Well, it's always a possibility, you're still gonna have legal fees.
Always have legal.
We're ready?
Not that I wanna say, it's kinda like engineering fees, get engineering fees, you don't even have a project sometimes, so.
We're preparing.
Right, we've already paid close to $3,000.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Have there been any other expenses, Alva?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Only that, because we, in meeting with the city, the school board, we knew that, we knew we had to do it legally, which was
Oh,
right.
right.
And I knew that it going then, it was either, we'd have to pay it either way. I mean, even if the referendum hadn't passed, we'd have to pay them anyway, because we had to have something, we
Right.
wanted to have something in writing.
Right.
So, did you guys do your motion?
Yeah, we
Yes?
did, we have a mo-
We have a motion, yeah.
clerk will call the roll.
Slusher.
Yes.
Fetch.
Yes.
Feltes.
Yep.
Wojni.
Yes.
Holstead.
Yes.
Motion carries.
A motion was, a motion was made to pay half of the, legal fees for the, community center,
Was it-
okay, Mary Jo's. Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign, okay? Oh, Nikki made the motion. Poor Nikki.
As far as the common council, I'd entertain a motion to go into closed
So
session.
moved.
Motion by Feltes, second by Fetch. Clerk will call the roll.
Fetch.
Yes.
Feltes.
Yep.
Wojni.
Yes.
Holstead.
Yes.
Fletcher.
Yep.
Okay, I make a motion for the library to go into closed session with the city council.
I can make a motion.
Okay, Karen seconded. Okay, roll call vote, Nikki,
Yes.
Mary Jo,
Yes.
Karen,
Yes.
and Amanda.
Yes.
Okay, we're in closed session.
All right, well,
Machine is